again. This is Casey Kasem. Welcome to American Top 40 and our countdown of this week's best-selling single records in the USA. 4 new songs in American Top 40 this week on our way to number 1. So let's get it on.
Number 40.
4 guys from Cleveland, Ohio. They call themselves Raspberries. A debut song called Go All the Way.
Number 28.
Here are 4 guys, all 22 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio. They call themselves the Raspberries. They got a big one at number 28 this week.
It's from coast to coast.
Well, here now is the current hit by a 4-member group that once put out an album that had such a strong smell that it made a customer in a record store pass out. Now, according to the record company, the store was in Vancouver, British Columbia, and the customer was a woman. She took a whiff of a strongly scented sticker pasted on the jacket of the album and fainted dead away. She revived pretty quickly, and she was perfectly all right. But the record store decided not to stock any more of the smelly records until they were forced to get it back in stock by popular demand. Well, the smell that KO'd that female customer was one of Raspberries, which just happened to be the name of the group that used the scented sticker as a promotion gimmick on their album. I remember that one. Their current hit isn't knocking them dead in the scented department, but it's doing just fine on the chart, moving up to number 30 this week. Here's Overnight Sensation, hit record by Raspberries.
American Top 40.
This is Casey on American Top 40, and it's time now for the hit song by an artist who spent his childhood studying to be a classical musician, and then changed his mind and his life after he heard the Beatles. His name is Eric Carmen, and when he was just 2.5 years old, his parents enrolled him in a music theory class at the Cleveland Institute of Music. At 5, he began studying violin with his aunt, who's a member of the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra. And for the next few years, while his friends were out playing baseball, Eric went along with his aunt and hung out at the orchestra rehearsals, listening to the musicians practice. When he was 11, he began studying piano, and by the time he was 15, he was playing music by Rachmaninoff and Chopin. And then he heard the Beatles. He says, and I quote, "I hadn't yet really chosen a direction for my life, and I'd have to say that did it. I was going to be a rock and roller." End of quote. Well, Eric dropped his classical studies and switched from piano to guitar. He also began listening to music by the Beach Boys, The Who, and, of course, the Beatles. And in 1970, he formed a group called the Raspberries, remember? And during the next few years, he put 4 records into the top 40. This week, he's there all by himself without his group at number 7. Here's Eric Carmen.
American Top 40.
Well, it's time now on AT40 for the second smash by a singer-songwriter from Cleveland who got his recording contract in a very unusual way. He flew the presidents of several record companies to his living room in Cleveland to hear him audition. The artist is the former lead singer of the Raspberries, Eric Carmen. And just after the group broke up back in May of '72, Eric wrote some new material and began shopping for a label. Then his producer, Jimmy Ienner, came up with a better way. Instead of just telling people how many hits Eric had already recorded and written, his producer invited the presidents of several major record companies to fly, at his expense, to Eric's home in Cleveland. Well, Eric tells us that Clive Davis of Arista Records was the first to accept that invitation, and after hearing 5 of Eric's new songs, Davis offered him a contract. Eric says he was delighted with the offer, but he wanted to speak with a few more people before he made a decision. And over the next month, several more record company presidents flew into his living room to catch his act. Finally, Eric decided to accept that first offer from Clive Davis. And you can bet Clive is glad he did, because this week, Eric is moving up the 40 with his second smash in a row. At number 19, this is Never Gonna Fall in Love Again.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
Well, now at number 29, we have a song from one of the most expensive albums ever made. If a major recording act today spends more than $60,000 to make an album, it's unusual. This album cost more than 6 times that much, over $250,000. How can a thing like that happen? Well, according to Eric Carmen, it's the false starts that kill you. To begin with, time in a recording studio with charges for space and equipment and engineers and fees for the musicians will run from several hundred to a couple of $1,000s per hour. And when you don't get it right the first time, that's money down the drain. Well, Eric Carmen took his first shot in London last year working with Elton John's producer, Gus Dudgeon. But nothing worked. So they threw those tapes out, and a couple of months later tried again in Cleveland, Ohio. But several weeks later, they gave up again. More waste. Then in Los Angeles, Eric and Gus tried it one more time with some of the highest-priced session musicians in the business. Another month, another failure. Finally, 8 months ago, Eric gave it one last try, this time doing the producing himself. 6 months later, the album was complete, and he was satisfied. The total cost advanced by the record company was a fantastic $375,000. That's an average of $37,500 per song. This is one of them. Moving up this week to number 29. Eric Carmen and She Did It.
The hits from coast to coast.
Well, now we're up to the man who admits he's a musical thief, but he's paying for his crime. He's 38-year-old singer-songwriter keyboard player Eric Carmen. And this is how Eric explains his musical pilferage. When he was growing up in Cleveland, he spent hours and hours every week studying classical piano. This lasted for a total of 13 years, from the time he was only 2 years old until the time he was 15. And that was in 1965. And at that time, rock and roll seemed a lot cooler than classical music. So Eric switched to electric guitar. After high school, he started a group called the Raspberries, and they hit the top 40 4 times. Then, a few years later, as a solo artist, Eric's years of classical training paid off. Literally. He told us ever since he was a kid, he always loved the classical music of Sergei Rachmaninoff. And one of Rachmaninoff's concerti inspired this hit. Listen.
Nobody's home.
A number 2 hit from 1976, All by Myself. Now, listen to a piece of the classical music that Eric Carmen modeled that hit on. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, same melody as All by Myself. Eric Carmen wrote another song based on a Rachmaninoff melody. Let me play a little of that classical piece first this time. Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony. Eric converted that melody into this hit from 1976. That's Never Gonna Fall in Love Again, a number 11 hit in 1976 for Eric Carmen, who borrowed the melody from one of his favorite composers, Rachmaninoff. But get this, the Russian composer died back in 1945, and the rights to his music still belong to the Rachmaninoff estate. So Eric worked out a deal. Every time you hear Never Gonna Fall in Love Again or All by Myself on the radio, a portion of Eric's royalties are going to the Rachmaninoff estate. Now, here's Eric with a pure pop tune at number 4 in our countdown, Hungry Eyes.
The hits from coast to coast.
I'm Scott Evans on American Top 40, in for Kasem this week. Now, the story of a concert the singer will never forget, though he'd like to. For Eric Carmen, it was Murphy's Law in full effect. If anything can go wrong, it will. Eric told interviewer Sandy Sturt Benjamin that it happened about 10 years ago. Eric was one of the acts booked to perform at a benefit concert in New York at Avery Fisher Hall. Things were a little rushed. Artists had to share some sound equipment, and no one got to do sound checks of the PA system. Couldn't even try out the microphones till you hit the stage. Eric recalls, about the only thing we did have was a pickup to mic the piano before the show. Well, the show went on, and after a few acts, Eric was on. He walked out on stage, sat down at a piano, and started to play and sing. Then suddenly, a third of the way into his song, the microphone pickup attached to the piano fell right in. Kerplunk. Eric says for the rest of the song, that's all she wrote. Later, Eric learned that during his performance, one entire side of the PA system was out, so he could barely be heard. And then finally, to top it all, there was a reviewer from Rolling Stone magazine in the audience. Eric says he really tore the show apart. He also says the review didn't mention any of the technical troubles. Quote, what it boils down to is that nobody cares why you were bad. They just know that you were bad. End of quote. That's Eric Carmen's vivid memory of his least memorable concert. They can't all be winners, but every time Eric thinks of it, he can console himself with a smash on the charts. At number 22, here's Make Me Lose Control.
The hits from coast to coast.
I'm Shadoe Stevens. This is American Top 40. Next, Eric Carmen graces the countdown with the 8th Top 40 hit of his solo career. But you know, glancing back into the misty AT40 golden grooveyard, we find that the 39-year-old singer was a member of a band called the Raspberries back in the 70s, remember? Bringing Eric's Top 40 total to 12 hits. I know, you're probably saying to yourself, gee, I wonder what Eric sounded like way back then. I sure wish Shadoe would play one of those old hits. Well, this is your lucky day. You might recognize the dulcet tones of Eric's golden throat on this little ditty from 1972. Go All the Way by Raspberries featuring Eric Carmen, then about 22 years old. The song made it to number 5 back in October of 1972. And now, fast forwarding to the present, we find Eric Carmen with a solo hit that went to number 3. We're heading into the second half of our countdown of the year's biggest hits. I'm Shadoe Stevens with an American Top 40 special, Billboard's Top 100 Songs of 1988. This next hit is by a man from Cleveland who started his career back in the early 70s with the power pop group Raspberries. In 1975, Eric Carmen went solo. And this year, he made a third successful run at the charts with a couple of big hits, both in the top 100. Here's one of them at number 38, Make Me Lose Control.
Casey's Countdown.
I'm Casey Kasem on Casey's Countdown. We're getting closer and closer to the number 1 song on this week's Adult Contemporary chart. Now, here's the song that was number 1 on the AC chart 20 years ago this week, back in 1976. It's by Eric Carmen, a singer from Cleveland who got his musical training studying the classics at the Cleveland Institute of Music. This is Eric Carmen and All By Myself.
American Top 20.
Media-based 24/7 ranks them, and we count them down on American Top 20. Well, now we're up to an American Top 20 Extra by Eric Carmen, a singer who was the mascot of the Cleveland Orchestra when he was only 3 years old. Eric Carmen was born and raised in Cleveland. He was a born entertainer. Whenever he got the chance, he would perform for family and friends. And at 3, Eric got the chance to do more than that. You see, his aunt played violin with the Cleveland Orchestra, and when Eric was 3, she gave him violin lessons, and she also took him to rehearsals and concerts of the orchestra as well. Everyone in the orchestra loved having him around. They adopted him as their orchestral mascot, a 3-year-old good luck charm, and they made him part of the show as well. Eric was given the job as first assistant to the percussionist. At a certain point in the concerts, he crashed the cymbals or banged a gong, always earning a big cheer from the audience. Eric went on to attend the Cleveland Institute of Music and to become a professional musician himself. To date, Eric has scored 8 big hits on our survey. Now, with an American Top 20 Extra, here's the former mascot, Eric Carmen, with one of those big hits, a number 1 smash from 1988. Here's Hungry Eyes.
Casey's Coast to Coast.